So it seems like fascism is on the rise again. We've got Trump has been re-elected, far-right anti-immigrant riots trying to burn down hotels that house migrants in the UK happened this summer. Elon Musk is pushing Nazi conspiracy theories on his Nazi website, which he hosts Nazis on. And there's a fascist leader in Italy that our Keir Starmer is very happy to cozy up to.
Sir Keir Starmer said today he was opening a new era with Europe and the partnership with Italy more important than ever.
Well, although there is one dead fascist in France, so I guess we've got one on the board recently, and that's good. And a lot of people view this rise of fascism as a sort of like fundamental opposition or reaction to the liberal or neoliberal order under which we're living. You know, it's like, do you want fascist Trump or neoliberal Kamala? That sort of thinking. It's like a one or the other type of thing. But this sort of thinking seems to me to be both individualizing, like making fascism into something fascist ideologues do, rather than like a constellation of features which make up a fascist society, but it also kind of undermines the various continuities between neoliberal societies and liberal ones and fascist ones. And it's in this context that Clara Mattei offers a really important intervention which clarifies these important continuities. Specifically, Mattei highlights how austerity as a form of authoritarian state practice functions to rebalance the capital relation in favour of capital, and in doing so paves the way to fascism in the early 20th century. So I talked briefly about this book in my roundup of my favourite books of the year, which I put up just at the end of last year there, but this is a sort of deeper review into that gives a bit more detail into this book, and we'll sort of prefigure the video that I'll do on fascism in a little bit. So Mattei begins her analysis by highlighting various contemporary cases across the world in which austerity has been tied together with mounting authoritarian state practices. In Chile, for example, in 2019, the government reacted to protests against the rise of subway fares with a dictatorship-style martial law. In 2015, the Greek government overturned the referendum to impose IMF austerity, resulting in protests and heavy-handed police crackdowns. And in the US, austerity policies have been an integral part of neoliberal governance for decades, which has come alongside a concomitant increase in policing. And these illustrations highlight the key features or some key features of austerity. The privatisation of state-held industry alongside pay cuts in public employees, increases in consumption taxes such as VAT, the implementation of disciplinary workfarist welfare regimes, attacks on collective labour and unions, increasing authoritarian state practice, and the decrease of capital gains and corporate taxes. Such features are justified with reference to a spectre of debt and deficit spending, with the aim to increase economic growth. And yet rarely, if ever, have austerity regimes achieved such goals. And Mattei grapples with this apparent contradiction by pointing out that while austerity has failed to achieve its goals of debt deficit reduction and economic growth, this doesn't mean that it's some irrational failure of a policy. You know, there's a very famous argument in relation to post-financial crash austerity in the UK, which basically says that austerity was pursued due to an accounting error on a spreadsheet of a paper. I saw a left-wing commentator make this point just yesterday. And it would be fun and kind of comforting, I guess, if this was true, if our enemies were just fools who've done this silly thing that doesn't make sense. They made an accounting error. They're ideologically blinded and they use this paper to prove themselves, and that's why they did austerity. But unfortunately, these sort of stories are just not how the world works. And I think it's helpful to capital to obscure the real function of austerity behind this sort of, joke that it was a result of a rational choice from an accounting error. How could you really blame them if they made a mistake if there was just a mistake on a spreadsheet somewhere? It's not really their fault. It's that they were fools at the end of the day, not that they were pursuing something rationally evil. Instead of like an accounting error or a mistake or an irrational policy failure, Mattei clarifies the function of austerity as a method of capitalism protecting itself during moments of potential challenge to its dominance, like the 2008 financial crash, or the profit crisis, the Vlocker shock of the 1970s, or World War I. Where austerity has proven wildly effective is in insulating capitalist hierarchies from harm during these moments of would-be social change. Austerity is capitalism's protector, popular among states for its effectiveness and billed as a means of fixing economies by increasing their efficiency. Short-term readjustments for long-term gains. However, if we view austerity as a response not just to economic crises, but to a crisis of capitalism, we can begin to see method in the madness. Austerity is a vital bulwark in defence of the capitalist system. Importantly for Mattei, crisis in capitalism isn't just simply an economic downturn or inflation, but when the fundamental relations of production are challenged, particularly as the power of labour increases. This is what she understands as a challenge to the capital relation in favour of labour. Austerity occurs to rebalance that relation in favour of capital. To illustrate her point, Mattei looks specifically at the two cases of Britain and Italy in the interwar periods. She demonstrates that in both cases, austerity was a reaction by capital against the growing power of organised labour and the recent enfranchisement of segments of the public who now had an unacceptable amount of control over the levers of economic decision-making. The reaction in both Italy and Britain was to turn to ever more inaccessible technocratic economics, which hides behind a claim of apolitical science. And I think this is quite interesting, given the periodic tantrum that economists on Twitter go through when you suggest that their discipline is maybe not actually science. Now, I'm not saying that economists are fascists. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that economists are fascist. So, in the interwar period, technocratic central banks with little to no democratic oversight were given immense power to impact wage and unemployment rates through their control of interest rates. In the case of interwar Italy, many of the supposedly apolitical technocratic economists who crafted this austerity measure became instrumental figures in Mussolini's fascist regime. It was a straight line. And this is not because of some accident, because both liberalism and fascism recognised that the driver of economic success was not labour, not the draining force of feckless workers, but the saver entrepreneur. That is, the apolitical economist had a fundamental ideological commitment to the bourgeois. So, in both Italy and Britain, authoritarian austerity was pursued. The difference was only that Italy relied more heavily on direct physical fascist violence to enforce the edicts of this apolitical economic ideal. And what separated Italian fascism and British authoritarian capitalism was not a matter of fundamental difference, but one of method. The Italian case exposes a repressive drive that was only latent in the British case and persists today in countries across the world. While in Italy industrial austerity directly subordinated labour through the banning of strikes and unions, except for fascist unions, a contradiction in terms seemingly, Britain's monetary austerity caused an economic downturn that indirectly achieved the same ends, which weakened workers' bargaining power and lowered wages. Rather than exercising direct political control and economic coercion as Italy did, Britain relied on seemingly apolitical technocrats. The structural violence of macroeconomic policy could do the same as the physical violence of fascist militias. Mattei's central thesis, then, is that within capitalist economies, particularly those that are pursuing austerity politics, there's always a latent potential for the re-emergence of fascist politics. And this is a particularly salient point to make at this moment, where neoliberal hegemony has necessitated the deep embeddedness of authoritarian austerity politics. Other people I've spoken about on this channel, like Ian Bruff and Bob Jessop, have written about neoliberalism embedding austerity politics within the very functioning of the state. Bob Jessop calls it an austerity polity. It's a notion that these features described by Mattei are so deeply embedded within the functioning of the capitalist state that it is incredibly difficult and maybe impossible without a massive social upheaval or revolutionary political action to reverse the authoritarian austerity structures. So, to take a brief detour into some British politics for a second, our Chancellor Rachel Reeves is under pressure and probably will step down because of reactions against some very limited spending and her economic policies, which has triggered a response to probably return to heavy-handed austerity.
And the Chancellor is facing a tough time in office amid an economic storm that's seen a recent spike in UK borrowing costs.
Now, I think that there's been a lot of misanalysis of what's going on here. And to sort of explain why, I'll quickly describe Bob Jessop's idea of 3 types of austerity. Conjunctural austerity, which were brief periods of tightening spending in reaction to a crisis. Once the crisis was over, normal amounts of state spending, of a state structure, they carried on as they had pre-crisis. Then you have enduring austerity. And this is a type of austerity which is much more embedded and long-lasting at the policy level. In the immediate aftermath of the 2008 financial crash, we had a long period of what you could describe as enduring austerity. The policies continued. It was an overt period of austerity policies, right? But since then, there's a third idea of austerity called an austerity polity, which we mentioned earlier. And that is when these enduring austerity policies become so embedded within structures of the state that they become part of it. And I think this is basically what's happened in the UK and in various other states, probably the US as well. And so when we look at Rachel Reeves, what I think's happened there is that there's been conjunctural spending to some degree. Not a lot, but it's about a small amount of conjunctural spending, which was always meant to be to avoid the crisis of austerity, so that we could do a little bit to get us out of this sort of malaise, to then continue with the austerity business as usual. I think what we're seeing right now is the exact reaction of that playing out. We've had the conjunctural austerity, and we had some conjunctural austerity during the COVID pandemic as well, as there was big spending projects, and that was immediately followed by some more austerity. So what I think has happened now, and I think what a lot of people have been getting wrong, is that Rachel Reeves was not necessarily continuing with the same enduring austerity policies as the Conservatives were, but the state was set up in such a way that austerity was always going to be returned to, because that is how the state works now. And the sort of worrying thing about that, in light of Mattei's analysis here, is that this could very well be a very clear road to fascism. So following from Mattei, we could basically argue that Trump versus Harris, or Starmer versus the Tories, or the Tories versus Reform is not fascism versus liberalism, but different forms of authoritarian neoliberalism where the fascist potentialities are more or less latent. But having said all this, and there is clearly a lot of explanatory use in Mattei's story, I think it still remains a bit incomplete. So while her examination of technocracy and authoritarian state practice is really valuable, her arguments regarding the capital relation don't at any point account for aspects beyond the direct labour relation, like the direct employer-employee relation. So the capital relation in Mattei's work is understood purely as the wage-labour capital relation. And this necessarily reduces the scope of all of these capital relations. Gendered reproduction, household labour, essential racial elements of this are entirely missing. For the labour relation to exist requires the daily and systematic reproduction of the labour force. And this happens through gendered division of labour, where women generally take household, unpaid, devalued domestic work. And that reproduces the worker, and through childcare, future workers. And I think this is really important and a really big oversight, because austerity measures, especially today, don't just reduce worker power, but cut the publicly accessible means of reproduction, which ends up forcing gendered divisions of labour within the household, reinforcing classic gendered divisions of labour. And this is a powerful means of upholding patriarchal dominance, and upholding central aspects of fascist political characters. Fascist politics is always hugely patriarchal. And similarly, through hard border regimes and racial discrimination, austerity regimes consistently maintain white supremacist racial regimes, while systematically lowering the value of racialised labour power. And in doing so, this lowers the value of labour power in general. And these are, I think, pretty essential elements of both the capital relation, but also of the constellation of features which make up fascism. Fascism isn't just a corporatist defence of the wage relation, but a system of extreme patriarchal and racial dominance. And missing out the racial and patriarchal elements of both the capital relation and fascism, I think Mattei misses just how latent fascism is within the neoliberal order. We miss the core elements of the rising tide of fascism, which produces patriarchal gender regulations, attacks on women's bodily autonomy, transphobia, as well as the white supremacy which produces far-right riots attacking migrants, or Trump's violent anti-immigration rhetoric. To properly account for the rise of fascism, we need to account for all elements of its constellation, not just the authoritarianism and a narrowly defined capital relation. So, to conclude, I think Mattei's work is extremely useful, and I would recommend reading it to understand the continuities not only between Britain and fascist Italy, but in the interwar period, but between fascist Italy and our current moment of rising fascism. It's really important and just fascinating to read about the consistent tools of authoritarian state practice which enable fascist regimes to rise. But I do think it's worth using Mattei's work not as an end, but as a jumping off point from which we can examine the many and varied ways in which austerity produces fascism. This includes the reproduction of regimes of patriarchy and racism as a constituent part of attacks on labour unions and of authoritarian state practices. And fundamentally, we're at a deeply scary moment politically. Liberalism, neo or otherwise, can't fight fascism because fascism isn't always latent potentiality within it. The only fix is revolution against liberalism, socialism, or barbarism. Alright, thanks for watching. Welcome to the first video of 2025. Let's see if I can keep on a regular upload schedule. We gotta keep posting. If you want to grow, you gotta keep posting. That's what people tell me. Anyway, so this was just a wee book review. Next one's going to be on green colonialism, and we'll get to the fascism video at some point, probably quite soon. But yeah, if you liked watching this video, please give it a like and a share. If you can, sign up to our Patreon, where you get early access to things like scripts, you get early access to the videos. You get some screenshots and some extra writing, and all that stuff. If you can't sign up to Patreon, you can give a one-off donation via Ko-fi or PayPal. $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits. So I'll just do that for them now. We've got Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Earl Grey Tea, Bonnie, Katie Marshall, Joshua Moldenhauer, Nina G. Public Relations, FD Signifier, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anisby, Ellis Wren, S, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Mason Colbert, Alex, Tim, Daniel Swing, Unoriginal Name, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Layum, Xander Corvus, Fia Westphal, Jack, TB Skyen, Christopher Puff, Morgusse, Tom Price, Cade Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Austin Talbin, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Duncan Skinner, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. And also $5 and up patrons get access to a Discord as well. That's there. Hope you enjoyed this, and love you. Bye.